What's your prediction on if we hit a soft landing, what happens to housing in the next 12 to 24 months?
I think the thing there is to also bucket it, right? So there's hard landing, recession. There's soft landing, inflation is tamed. We don't have recession, and the Fed eases up on rates. And then there's the third bucket, which is where we are right now, which is no landing higher for longer. And it's a question of, in that theory, we avoid recession, but which of the other two buckets are we in? Is inflation starting to be a little more sticky, or does the Fed feel like we've actually landed this plane? And so those two latter buckets would, of course, affect the answer there, because if it's the no landing, it's probably more of a depressed housing transaction volume. I think it's the middle bucket that the industry would like, which is soft landing, inflation tamed, Fed starts cutting rates, the affordability aspect of the market improves, transaction volumes go up. The interesting question is, putting aside the middle bucket, the soft landing, the sweet spot, which would the industry prefer? The no landing higher for longer, or the hard landing recession? Because that latter one, that would bring rates down the fastest of all of them, and probably has way more transaction volume than the no landing higher for longer bucket. And then plus, the longer you stay in that higher for longer, no landing bucket, your odds of recession are still there because you haven't landed one way or the other still.
Recession also gives probably the highest chance of getting prices in a more affordable range, certainly, closer to what the majority of buyers can afford, because those rates come down. But also in a recession, you would envision more people having to sell because if they're losing their job, which could create more inventory. Do you think the recession, because a soft landing, I could see prices going up because of the pent up demand, right? So would recession be our only chance at a more affordable existing home sale?
In terms of overall
Just
affordability?
on price, not overall. Like let's
No,
go price, because I think
well,
we all agree rates would be lower, or lower faster, but on price.
I think there are some people, CoreLogic, obviously AEI, Housing Center, Zillow, that are like, you know what, higher for longer is not going to bring down prices. We have already bottomed, is their view. I talk to a lot of other housing economists who don't hold that view, or at least aren't willing to let themselves hold that view yet. They want to see, obviously, the second half of this year, because there's the potential that seasonality could bite harder both ways. So in the beginning of the year, seasonality bit very hard, and we shifted very quickly from that December, January low into the January, February upswing, and that's because existing inventory was just so tight. But what's happened is that upswing that we saw in the first half of the year has only deteriorated housing affordability back to where it was in October and November. These price gains plus mortgage rates inching back up. So it's, as we move into the second half of the year, is it possible that deteriorated affordability, the other side of the market, bites back harder the other way? And that would kind of be like what we saw in the 90s, which is, appreciation in the spring and then blowing it off in the second half of the year. Next year, same thing. And you kind of went through a few years of it. One reason that some people don't think that's going to happen is because appreciation was just so strong in the first half of the year. That would kind of be like the Zillow camp. So I do think that a lot of the models that I look at do believe that the recession, hard landing, is probably the most likely to pull further, although there's some disagreement there. And then if we stay in this higher for longer period, I think it's a little uncertain still how the price side works out. But again, right now what we're seeing is, when I say uncertain, that could mean, going down 3 or 4%, right? Like, is that risk still there? I'm not talking about risk of like something dramatically to the downside right now. The way that some of those Western markets were hit last year, that's something I'm keeping my eye on moving into the second half of the year.
I tend to agree with the seasonality, taking some of the increases off a bit. Lisa, you want to jump in? What's the top of your mind with Lance?
For me, it's really kind of looking at, I think, going back to the lock-in effect. And I think my big question is, from your opinion, what's the one thing that's going to change it? Is it tied to rates? Is it tied to seasonality? How do we get out of it?
Acceptance and affordability improvements would be, I think those two would be the top two. And the third, which goes back to actually the first and the second, is time. You look at some of the models produced by like Goldman, they don't think that existing is going to get back to pre-pandemic levels until 2027. So they're a little bearish there because they're higher for longer. But I think you probably need some affordability improvements here.